When I got to the archives in Germany, the Bundesarchiv, the political archive of the foreign ministry, and even more importantly, the archives in South Africa and Namibia, in Cape Town, Pretoria, and Windhoek, Namibia's capital, I realized that in trying to trace what happened to this law, the story really couldn't be separated from the broader history of how whiteness and blackness or indigeneity was constructed and how kind of interstitial figures and populations and groups were treated. And so it really became about the construction of the category of colored.
I came across him in a book that I was reading. There was a brief mention about him, and then I was in Brazil and I found heaps on him in the National Archives there, and then decided to research him further. And that really took me to Venezuela, into Colombia, and then to the United States as well.
So I went to the archives in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and I looked at the records of both the president and the prime minister. And in addition, I did some archival work at Cornell University, where they have a collection of Vietnamese periodicals.
And so the first archive I went to was the Rockefeller Archive Center in Tarrytown. And that is, I guess, maybe a luxurious experience for archives. It's in a beautiful old mansion up on a hill overlooking the Hudson, and they offer you tea, and you email the archivist and she emails you back and is like, we have these boxes with these folders and they're all ready for you when you get there. And so my expectations were maybe a little high going into other archive centers.
So I was very lucky that part of the material was stored in the Columbia University Rare Book collection. So I started off in New York with the Carnegie collections, and then went on to Paris and Geneva for the UNESCO and League of Nations archives respectively, as well as some government documents from Berlin, which was convenient because I'm from Berlin. And afterwards also a few documents from Oxford and LSE archives.
In terms of the America Society, I had emailed a bunch of times and tried to get in touch with someone, and it's an organization that is still running as a museum, and so there's not someone, they don't have an archivist whose job it is to deal with people like me saying, I would like to write about you. And so I had to just go to the building one day, and I was lucky because it was in New York, and all of the doors were closed, so I wandered down some stairs and found myself in the basement with security guards, and I asked very nicely if they could tell me how I could get in touch with someone in the archives, and they found the woman who was the assistant curator of the museum right now, or the gallery right now, and she gave me her card, and that's how I was able to eventually access those documents. So you may have to step outside your comfort zone and maybe break and enter a little bit, but it pays off in the end to sort of be persistent in terms of the archives.
I really knew very little about Emiliano Mundruca when I started researching, only that he was from Brazil, and I could find specific documents on him in Brazil, I hoped. And then that kind of unraveled into a much bigger, a much broader story that took me to Boston. Boston wasn't on my research agenda at the very beginning. I had to add Boston to it at the end. But I found out one day that looking in newspapers that he actually lived in Boston for 30 years, and no one had really known that. So I discovered that he was actually a Freemason. So one of the most interesting things one of the most interesting places I went to for my research was the Freemasons Hall in Massachusetts, and I went to the library there, which is very helpful, and I got a tour around the Freemason building, a free tour, which is extremely interesting and very mysterious.
In the same room for a good month, I was able to travel through the correspondences of these women who had traveled the whole world, who had dug deeper into jungles and swam deeper into oceans than anyone I had ever met. And so I was able to move through my research, although I was still.
Interesting things to be found, photographs of the conference rooms and buildings at the time, which are normally rare, especially for something odd like this International Studies Conference. So that's, I guess, an interesting discovery. Also to find that Columbia University, both Columbia University and LSE, were actually heavily involved in the whole history. So sometimes I found information on the very classroom that I was working in at Columbia. which at the time I think used to be the headquarters of the American Political Science Association or something, which is now the history department. So yeah, you find this invitation card for Fairweather Hall, and you're like, hey, wait a second. That's where I had my, I don't know, International History 101 with Matthew Connolly.
There was no one in the Freemason buildings, but it was extremely grandiose, and you had portraits of Benjamin Franklin, among other very famous US statesmen. It was essentially as ostentatious as one could imagine inside, and extremely old and somewhat creepy, but a very strong sense of history inside.
I had one particular moment in which I was super happy. While I was reading my sources in the archives still, so in the British National Archives, I read the document that said that British politicians had been negotiating with the UN covertly, and that the UN was actually, the UN High Commissioner of Refugees was actually acting on the British behest. And I found this super interesting, and I made a note, but somehow I lost the note, which always happens. Somehow there's always this one document which is really crucial to your argument, which you then cannot find anymore. But I had bought, and this is a really cool thing, and you should all consider this, I had bought OCR software to make my documents machine readable. And so the moment I needed my document, I could just Google, I could text search my documents. And when I found it, it was this moment of pure joy that I had, like, oh my God, technology is really a good thing in historical research.
You find a document and there's a sentence on the document that's very relevant to your topic, and then you smile.
His photographic archive of this project is actually held by the Smithsonian Institution. So another thing that I did when I was in DC was, go and look at his archives. And all of them are digitized, all of them are online. So I'd already seen, most of the 1,700 photos that he took. But being in the archives, like, it was amazing to be there and actually see the contact prints that he had made with his marks of cropping ideas and which images he thought were stronger than others. And then he had made some large prints also of some of the photographs. And they still had the darkroom chemical smell on them, which was amazing.
The Tunisian archives were the first archives I'd ever set foot in, and I spent about a month and a half in Tunis doing that. And then by the time I got to France and looked at the archives there, I was really used to reading handwritten documents. It was just a lot easier, and so it goes a lot faster. And I was only in the French archives in Nantes for 1 week, and I literally found maybe 60% of what I ended up using in my dissertation. So that was, just in terms of methods and historical research, it was exciting to have reached that point.
Communication and transportation took a lot more time. People had to put a lot more effort into reaching another corner of the world and to communicate with someone across an ocean. And so usually there was a lot more depth and thought put into these correspondences, and it was a very intimate experience to be able to window into these moments.
In terms of documents that really stood out, I think in the Brazilian archives there was a couple that stood out because they were so difficult to read and it took me hours to read, but eventually were extremely interesting. If you imagine writing in the early 1800s, especially in Portuguese, which is not my strongest language, working in the archives was rather tedious at the beginning, but very rewarding.
The linguistic aspect was definitely a challenge for me, so working in Vietnamese was really thrilling and enriching, but it also made for some challenges in terms of communicating with the staff there.
I had some documents in Arabic, especially this one, religious treatise, which it was hard to read it. And I had one of my Tunisian friends go over my translation. I don't even she had a hard
I
time.
worked with a research assistant in Vietnam who helped me with some translations, who was a Vietnamese student. And I remember having one conversation with him over coffee while I was in Vietnam about what he thought were the religious nuances of the documents that I was reading, which is something that as a native English speaker I would not have necessarily understood or been sensitive to. So I remember having this conversation with him that was really enlightening because it provided another layer of kind of, again, linguistic understanding of the documents that I was looking at that was really revealing.
I struck up a conversation with the curator sort of at the end, and she was asking what I was writing about, and we just started talking about the challenges of running a gallery that's under the umbrella of a cultural organization that is supposed to be about hemispheric unity. And even today, she was saying that there are a lot of challenges, and obviously couldn't be totally open about her criticisms, but to speak to someone now who's confronting those issues was invaluable in shaping how I talked about it.
You know, working in archives in different languages is, if you're not a native speaker, even if you speak, in my case at least, very good Spanish, is very difficult. I remember I got into a lot of trouble the first day I went to the Brazilian National Archive because I had a pen in my hand.
In order to tell any story, you need to use archives from all places that you're looking at, or actually even sometimes archives from a country that's even only remotely tied to the story you're looking at. So oftentimes you have to work with different languages, but that's sort of the only way to tell a story fully.
It's just a matter of searching and efficiency until you find the really good stuff.
Bam 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 bam